Hey guys, welcome to week 4 of our series, What to Do When You Don't Know What to Do. So last week we were talking about when we find ourselves in tough positions, if we want to live with integrity, sometimes the right thing to do is just to do the next right thing. Today we're going to be talking about something a little bit different. We're going to be talking about dealing and addressing the fact of why do I find myself in the situations I'm in. So one of my favorite movies growing up was the original Star Wars trilogy. And I absolutely love these movies. I would watch them all the time. I had them memorized. They're one of the best. But as I was growing up, when I had the original trilogy, something crazy happened that I never expected. We ended up getting the prequels. And so we saw the backstory of who Darth Vader really was before he became Darth Vader. And it was really cool to watch it because we got to see him grow up. We got to see who he was before the man he became. And you started to empathize for him in a way that I originally didn't. But then we got something even after that, which you guys know about. We got the second trilogy that happens after the original trilogy. And that was crazy to watch because we got to see what happened with his son and all the generations after Darth Vader once they became older. And so what was cool about all these things is that when we deal with one movie, if we just deal with episode 4, 5, or 6, you see this character Darth Vader and you like him, you think he's cool, but then when you add the prequels and when you add the trilogy after, you get a whole new perspective of who he is as a person. And you really appreciate what he's going through in that moment because of what happens to him before and after. And so seeing the big picture helps us to kind of understand what happens in a particular moment. And that's what we're going to be talking about tonight in the story of Joseph. Looking back at some of the things we talked about, we know that he lived with his family, got sold into slavery, ends up in Egypt, ends up becoming a really powerful person in Potiphar's house, but then something happens to him. He gets accused of something that he didn't do, and he ends up in prison. And he finds himself in jail. And he's in there, and it stinks. He ends up spending years in jail. But then something else happens. 2 people that work for the king of Egypt end up getting thrown in jail as well. And we're gonna see in the story what happens in the dynamic between these 2 guys and Joseph while they're in prison. And we're gonna be reading Genesis chapter 40, verses 4 through 8. Let's read it together. It says, after they had been in custody for some time, each of the 2 men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were being held in prison, had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. When Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. So he asked Pharaoh's officials who were in custody with him in his master's house, why do you look so sad today? We both had dreams, they answered, but there is no one to interpret them. Then Joseph said to them, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dream. So what happens here is Joseph's able to tell them what their dreams actually meant. And he gave them an interpretation that could have only come from God. But he asked the 2 guys, hey, when you get out of jail, please remember me. Please remember what I did for you and help me to get out. And so the guys end up getting out of jail. One of them goes back to be working for the king, but completely forgets about Joseph for years. And think about what Joseph might be thinking in this moment. He did the right thing for these guys. He helped these guys out. He asked them to remember him when they get out of jail, but he finds himself in jail for years after that. He could be thinking to himself in that moment, why is this happening to me? Why am I going through this? Why do I have to be in this prison for something I didn't do? And I think those are similar to feelings that we all struggle with. Because at the end of the day, we all find ourselves in tough situations. And we all can end up asking ourselves, why am I here? Why is this happening to me? Why has God forgotten me in this moment? But what we have to remember in those situations is that when we don't know what to do, we have to remember that our problems can position us for a purpose. Because what ends up happening to Joseph is that the king ends up having a dream that he doesn't know about. The king has a dream that he needs interpreted. And that guy that Joseph helped years before instantly remembered what Joseph was able to do. And Joseph ends up getting released from jail, goes and interprets the dream of the king, and ends up being put in the highest position of power in all of Egypt. So even though Joseph was in a tough situation and didn't understand what was happening, God was able to use him in that moment in a bigger picture and ended up accomplishing more things than Joseph ever could imagine in his life. And so even though there was a moment of struggle, in the big picture, it turned into something good. And that's the hope that we need to remember to hold on to. Because just because something happens doesn't mean it was something that God did to us or that it's something that God wanted for us. But even if we find those moments in struggle, it doesn't mean that God can't use those for something greater later on. It doesn't mean that God isn't going to use that struggle for the bigger picture in the future. And that's just a hope that we have to hold on to no matter what. So I want to share with you guys one more verse, and this comes out of Romans. It's Romans chapter 8, verse 28. It says, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him." You see, just because we find ourselves in tough situations, we don't necessarily always gonna have the answer as to why. We're not always gonna understand, God, why do I have to go through this? But what we can remember and what we can hold on to is that just because it's a tough situation now, doesn't mean that God's not gonna use it for something good in the future. So when you guys are talking in small groups, I encourage you, think about what are some moments that you've struggled with in the past? What are some things that you went through that you didn't necessarily want to go through? And what was God able to do in those moments that ended up being for something good later on? Let's talk about that when we go into group.